Step away, now." The shout cracked through the bright morning like a baton on metal. A police sergeant's hand closed around the thin forearm of an old man at the curb, fingers digging into sleeve and skin. The cane skittered, a hollow clack against sun-baked asphalt, and the veteran's cap tumbled into chalky dust. Lawn chairs groaned as people leaned forward. Mothers tightened grips on children's shoulders. The brass of a distant marching band kept coming, steady and indifferent, while the old man did not resist. He simply squared his shoulders and fixed his eyes on the oncoming flag, refusing to turn away. The sergeant angled his body to push him back into the crowd line, palm flat, jaw set. Heat rose off the road in wavering sheets. The scent of sunscreen and kettle corn mixed with fuel from idling antique trucks. A small boy's paper flag stopped fluttering mid-air as the boy's arm froze. The veteran's right hand, mottled and scar-roped, found the cane head again and steadied. Breath collected in his chest like a held note. He lifted his chin the length of a coin and stood as if the years could be braced against with posture alone. "You're obstructing," the sergeant snapped, voice tight enough to cut. "Back behind the line, now." The orange webbing of the barricade bit into the veteran's waist when the officer shoved. A few teenagers laughed, too quickly, then went quiet when the old man brought his feet together and drew his shaking hand toward his brow. The salute rose half an inch before the sergeant yanked his wrist down, the tendons standing out like cord beneath paper skin. A gasp rolled through the front row. A woman mouthed, "Don't," as if prayer could change policy. The drumline grew louder. Snares rattled like hail against tin. Sun flashed off chrome hubcaps and off the gold fringe of the color guard's standard. The veteran's eyes never left the leading edge of silk. His mouth set into a straight line, the kind a man holds to keep pieces of himself from spilling. Dust clung to the fallen cap at his feet. He did not bend. He did not plead. He endured the grip on his arm the way one endures weather, by outlasting it. Beyond the cordon, halfway up the reviewing stand, a man in a dark suit stood without moving. He had not applauded yet, had not waved. Red tie stilled, hands resting on the rail, he watched with a frown that deepened rather than rose. An aide leaned toward him and whispered. He did not answer. He only slipped his cap from his head and held it against his chest, eyes on the old soldier who would not look away from the flag that was almost upon them, because someone else was watching. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. William Harker was 85 years old, though anyone watching him at that moment would have seen less a frail old man than a figure carved out of stubborn will. His cane was not decoration, but necessity, the kind of necessity that comes from a wound taken so long ago. Most had forgotten it ever happened. He had not forgotten. The scar in his thigh ached every winter, like a memory that refused to loosen its grip. The cane itself he had carved decades earlier, whittled from a length of oak with steady hands that had once gripped a rifle in the Korean winter. Today, it served both as balance and anchor as he faced down a younger man's shove. For nearly 6 decades, William had attended this same Memorial Day parade on Main Street. Once he had marched in it, boots striking rhythm with the drums, chest proud, uniform pressed. Now he came as a spectator, but not a passive one. Every year he arrived early, taking his place near the curb where the flags would pass closest. There he would rise, no matter the weather, and bring his hand to his brow and salute. It was his ritual, his covenant with the memory of men who had not lived to grow old. This morning had begun as always. He had risen before the sun, pressed his olive jacket until the seams were sharp as blades, and polished the brass buttons, though no one else would notice them. The air had smelled faintly of cut grass and dew as he walked the 3 blocks from his small house to the parade route, cane clicking on the sidewalk. He had nodded to neighbors, setting up folding chairs, offering the same smile he had offered for years, though many were younger now and did not know his name. His place was always the same. Front row, left of the reviewing stand, where he could see the colors approach straight on. But today, there had been new barricades. Bright orange webbing stretched tight, held in place by steel posts hammered into the pavement. Volunteers guided families behind them. Children perched on camp stools, faces painted red, white, and blue. It should not have mattered. William had stepped forward to the line as he always did, cane in one hand, cap in the other. The sergeant had noticed him immediately, eyes narrowing, seeing only an obstruction where others might have seen a figure of tradition. His order had been barked without hesitation, his grip sharp as iron. The crowd around William had shifted uncomfortably, but no one had stepped in. A few whispered to each other. Some recognized him, the old soldier who came every year, who never missed the salute. Others, newer to town or younger in years, simply saw an elderly man in stubborn defiance of rules they assumed must have purpose. In that hesitation, the injustice had space to grow. And still William Harker stood, cane planted firmly at his side, eyes locked forward. His body bore the marks of age, but his presence carried something heavier than time. It was discipline, ingrained from days when hesitation cost lives. His silence was not weakness. It was the silence of a man who understood endurance better than most. Today, the silence would not be enough. The parade pressed on, as if nothing had happened. Drums rolled down the length of Main Street, steady and martial, their echoes bouncing off brick storefronts draped in bunting. The air was thick with summer warmth, the sun rising higher until the flagpoles shimmered against a backdrop of deep blue. Children cheered when the high school band appeared, trumpets gleaming, trombones sliding in crisp arcs. Vendors called out the prices of lemonade, and the mingled scents of fried dough and popcorn drifted over the crowd. The small-town pageantry moved forward, but William Harker's struggle lingered like smoke after a fire. He stood close enough to the barricade that his shoes touched the metal base, his cane pressed into the pavement, his knuckles pale from the grip. Every step the honor guard took forward seemed to pull his posture straighter, as if his spine remembered the drills even when his muscles resisted. His eyes never left the approaching flags, and though sweat glistened at his temples, he refused to wipe it away. He did not break his line, not even when the sergeant planted himself squarely in front of him, arms folded across his chest like a gatekeeper. Murmurs rose and fell from behind him. A woman whispered to her husband, "Why not just let him stand?" The man shrugged, muttering, "Rules are rules." A teenager nearby snorted, tapping his phone as he whispered, "He's blocking the view." Not everyone was cruel, but indifference cut just as sharply. William heard enough to understand. He was no longer seen as part of the parade, only as a disruption to it. When the veterans in antique jeeps passed by, their uniforms faded but their salutes sharp, William's hand twitched toward his forehead. The sergeant shifted quickly, as if anticipating him, his shadow swallowing the old man's gesture. William lowered his arm but squared his stance, feet firm against the asphalt. His lips pressed thin, the tension in his jaw a quiet defiance. Children on the other side of the barricade waved plastic flags on sticks, their bright colors snapping in the air. One little boy pointed at William and asked his mother, "Why is that man standing like that?" The mother glanced at the sergeant, then back at her child, whispering, "He probably thinks he's still a soldier." The words stung in their casual dismissal, though William did not let his face betray it. His silence was his armor, his dignity sealed behind composure. The parade wagon carrying the Gold Star families rolled by, their portraits held aloft by mothers and fathers whose grief had not dimmed with time. William's hand lifted halfway before faltering. The sergeant gave a small shake of his head, lips pressed in irritation. William steadied himself again, pressing harder on the cane, as if grounding himself into the pavement would root him against further humiliation. More whispers now, some sympathetic, some skeptical. "That's old Harker. Marched here back in the 60s. Another voice, doubtful. "Are you sure? Thought he left town for years." Rumors swirled like gnats in the summer heat, none of them fully true, all of them enough to cloud the perception of a man who had simply come to stand for his flag. The brass section blared louder, the rhythm of the parade quickening. William exhaled slowly through his nose, each breath measured, each motion deliberate. To anyone watching closely, it was clear he was not simply enduring the parade. He was measuring himself against it. Every float that passed, every wave ignored, every whisper that questioned him became another weight he bore in silence. No one stepped forward yet. No hand extended in recognition, no voice raised in his defense. The crowd shifted, restless, unsure whether to see him as a stubborn relic or a living emblem. And in that hesitation, William remained alone, standing where he had always stood, with only his cane, his silence, and his unbroken gaze toward the colors approaching. No one stood. Yet, the parade reached its solemn center. The color guard advanced, their white gloves crisp against the polished rifles they carried. And behind them, the great flag of the nation billowed, its fabric catching sunlight until it glowed like fire. For William Harker, this was the moment he came for every year, the moment he had lived through winters of ice and summers of sweat to honor. His cane shifted half an inch as he braced, body rising, right arm trembling but rising with it, the salute forming as if from memory etched into his bones. The sergeant moved instantly, cutting across his path with a single step. His hand struck William's arm, not violently, but with enough force to knock it down before it could reach his brow. "Enough!" he barked, his voice slicing through the music. "You're done here! Step back!" The sound was sharp, official, carrying authority that cared nothing for the meaning of the act it had just halted. The crowd gasped in unison, the sound rolling like a wave through the front rows. A hush followed, so complete that the snare drums seemed to echo too loudly in the distance. William's beret, loosened by the shove, slipped from his head again. This time it fell directly onto the street where the flag's shadow stretched across the pavement. Slowly, with painful stiffness, he bent at the waist, one hand pressing on the cane for balance as the other reached for the fabric. His fingers brushed dirt, trembled, then closed around the cap. From behind him, laughter cracked through the silence, high, careless laughter from a group of teenagers standing near the curb. One of them muttered, "Can't even bend without falling over." Their voices weren't loud, but in that moment they carried across the space with cruel clarity. A man near them began to step forward, his expression dark, but the sergeant cut his movement with a quick cutting gesture. "Don't interfere," he snapped, his glare daring anyone else to try. The would-be ally froze, shoulders tight, retreating into the crowd as if cowed by the uniform's authority. The whispers grew heavier now, not just curiosity, but judgment. Why doesn't he just sit down? He's too old for this. Someone needs to move him. William straightened, placing the beret carefully back on his head. The gesture was deliberate, reverent, his hand lingering a moment on the brim as if sealing something more than fabric into place. His lips quivered as he pressed them into a line, but he did not speak. He simply resumed his stance, shoulders squared, gaze forward, the cane a pillar, holding up more than just his frame. The officer, unsatisfied, stepped closer still. His voice rose louder, carrying over the band, over the flag snapping in the breeze. "This isn't your place. Go back. Now." His words rang sharp enough to sting, meant not just for William but for everyone within earshot. The humiliation was public, deliberate, broadcast to the crowd as law and order against one old man's ritual. The children nearby had stopped cheering. Their paper flags drooped in their hands, their wide eyes darting between the officer's scowl and the old veteran's silence. Parents pulled them back slightly, uncomfortable, unwilling to choose sides but unwilling to look away. The tension hung heavy, like a rope pulled taut. William did not flinch. He adjusted the line of his jacket, tugged it closed with precise, almost military care. Then he turned his eyes back to the flag, lifting his chin, refusing to look at the man in uniform beside him. He would not give him that. His silence said more than argument ever could. It said endurance. It said discipline. It said, "I have stood for worse storms than this." And still, the old soldier did not flinch. The parade rolled onward, the brass band fading as the flag moved further down the street. For most, the moment passed into the noise and spectacle of floats and fire trucks. But for William Harker, the air around him still vibrated with the sting of the sergeant's command. He did not shift his stance. He did not sag under the weight of stares. He remained as he was, shoulders squared, chin lifted, cane planted like a staff anchoring him to the earth, his lips pressed together in a thin seam, the kind forged not from weakness, but from control. He was not going to give the crowd, or the man who had shoved him, the spectacle of his breaking. Sunlight poured directly into his eyes now, harsh and unrelenting, yet he did not shade his gaze. His right hand rose again, slow, trembling, but deliberate. He brought it to his brow and held it there in salute. The gesture wavered only because of muscle and age, never because of doubt. His arm shook as though carrying invisible weight, yet it remained until the last corner of the flag vanished into the sea of uniforms farther down the route. Only then did he let the hand fall, lowering it with precision, the exact angle, the exact care that had been drilled into him in another century under another sky. He blinked against the moisture that had gathered in the corners of his eyes, but he did not lift a hand to wipe it. To wipe would have been to admit. Instead, he let the tears stay where they were, shimmering faintly against skin mapped with years of sun and wind. His silence held firm. Not one word escaped him. Not one plea. Not one protest. His body language alone spoke of the kind of discipline that endures humiliation without surrendering dignity. Around him, the crowd felt the shift. The laughter that had erupted earlier withered into quiet. Parents adjusted in their seats, uneasy. A few looked at each other, eyes softening with the first prick of realization. They were watching a man who had lived through storms of cold, fire, and loss, and he was meeting this insult not with anger, but with the stillness of a soldier who knew how to outlast storms. The absence of reaction became the loudest reaction of all. The sergeant shifted beside him, uncertain now. He had barked, shoved, ordered. He had made his point and drawn lines in the sand. Yet the old man's silence, his refusal to move or lash out, unsettled him in ways defiance never would have. He folded his arms across his chest again, but his jaw tightened. Authority could silence a voice. It could not erase dignity when dignity was held like a shield. William adjusted his jacket once more, smoothing the wrinkles as though each crease mattered. His thumb brushed against one of the brass buttons, its dull shine the last remnant of the uniform he had once worn. He pressed his palm flat against it for a heartbeat, then let the hand fall again, cane steady. The gesture was small, nearly invisible, but it was ritual. It was control. It was the quiet declaration that no shove, no command, no humiliation could strip away the identity he carried. The floats rolled by with paper streamers, children tossed candy to the sidewalks, and the noise swelled around him again. Yet to those closest, the contrast was unmistakable. Where others cheered and clapped and filled the air with noise, William Harker stood silent, still, and unbroken. In that quiet, the heart of the parade was revealed not in spectacle, but in one man's refusal to yield. And somewhere beyond the cordon, in the shaded seats of the reviewing stand, another man in a suit had noticed. His hand, resting on the rail before him, curled into a fist. His eyes did not waver from the figure at the curb. From his place on the shaded platform of the reviewing stand, Governor Samuel Dwyer had not applauded the marching bands or waved at the antique cars rolling by. His aides had nudged him, whispered reminders about visibility, but he had ignored them. His gaze remained locked on the frail figure standing alone against the barricade. He saw what others missed, the deliberate way the man held his cane not as a crutch, but as a standard. The posture squared against humiliation, the salute raised and lowered with the exactitude of drilled memory. It was not theater. It was testimony. Dwyer shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The summer sun reflected off the brass insignia pinned discreetly beneath his lapel, a token of service from another war, another era. He had been a Marine in Vietnam, decades earlier, when the jungles never dried and the rain never stopped. He remembered the jeers that met him when he stepped off the plain stateside, the cold stares that told him his uniform was not welcome. Watching the sergeant shove William Harker, watching the crowd turn its face, was like reopening that wound. He tasted the bitterness of it at the back of his throat. The aides at his side murmured again. One, a young man with polished shoes and a tablet tucked under his arm, leaned close and whispered, "Governor, do you want us to intervene?" The governor's head turned slowly, his eyes narrowing with the weight of decision. Then he shook it once, firmly. Not yet. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who understood timing the way a soldier understands cover fire. Some actions had to wait until they mattered most. His attention returned to William. He watched the old veteran bend painfully to retrieve his fallen beret, watched the mocking laughter from the crowd cut through the silence, watched the man straighten again with dignity, untouched. Dwyer's jaw clenched, muscles twitching beneath the clean-shaven skin of his cheek. His hand found the brim of his own cap and lifted it, pressing it against his chest in silent recognition. He knew what he was seeing. This was not an old man's stubbornness. This was a soldier's final act of loyalty, standing when others sat, enduring when others mocked. The sergeant's barked orders rang out again, sharp and officious, but Dwyer noticed how the veteran did not respond. No backtalk, no protest, only stillness. That stillness burned hotter than argument. It was the same kind of stillness he had seen in foxholes, in men who refused to cry out even when the jungle closed in around them. That silence was strength disguised as fragility. Around the governor, the crowd continued to cheer the floats, to wave at the performers, to move candy wrappers under their shoes. Yet those closest to William had fallen into a hush, uneasy, as if realizing that something larger than a parade was unfolding right before them. Dwyer read the faces. Children confused, parents unsettled, elders remembering. And he knew then that this was no longer simply about William. It was about every veteran who had ever stood unrecognized, who had ever been told to move aside when all they wanted was to stand for their flag. The governor leaned forward, hands resting on his knees now, his entire body drawn taut with decision. His aides glanced at each other nervously, uncertain whether to restrain him or let him be. Dwyer gave no order. He simply waited, eyes fixed, jaw set. The time would come. He would know when. He hadn't planned to intervene. But then the insult went too far. The parade's rhythm began to thin as the last of the marching bands faded into the distance. The avenue was left with only the hum of engines and the shuffle of dispersing crowds. Vendors closed their coolers, children bent to collect scattered candy, and the buzz of conversation swelled. Yet at the curb, William Harker still stood. His cane trembled lightly where it pressed into the asphalt, but his spine remained straight, his gaze unbroken. The sergeant, arms crossed in impatience, lingered beside him like a shadow determined not to move. William shifted as if to leave. His weight tipped against the cane, each step cautious, deliberate. The beret sat firmly on his head once more, its faded fabric darker from sweat. He turned slightly from the street, a man withdrawing with quiet dignity. Then, from behind him, the sergeant's voice rang out, sharper than before, laced with ridicule. "Better luck next year." It carried farther than he intended. Heads turned, conversations stilled. The laughter of a moment before was smothered by the harshness of the words. Before William could lower his gaze, another voice cut through the air. It was not loud, not shouted, but it carried with the weight of command that years of authority had tempered. "That is enough." The sound of it shifted the atmosphere at once. People stilled. Even the sergeant stiffened as if struck. The words hung heavy, undeniable. From the reviewing stand, Governor Samuel Dwyer descended the steps with slow, deliberate strides. His polished shoes struck the wood, then the pavement, each step echoing with a cadence that drew the crowd's eyes. His aides scrambled to follow, but stayed back when they saw the expression on his face. He did not need them. His presence was enough. The governor approached the cordon and stopped beside William. He did not look at the officer first. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he removed his cap and pressed it against his chest. His head inclined slightly toward the old veteran. "This man stands where he chooses," he said, voice low but audible to all who strained to listen. The crowd fell silent. The sergeant's eyes darted between the governor's face and the insignia glinting at his lapel. His posture faltered. The rigid line of his jaw slackened under the sudden recognition of who now stood before him. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself with regulations and orders, but the words died before they could form. The authority in front of him outweighed any script he had been given. William blinked, his lips parting as though he meant to speak, but no words came. His confusion was plain, yet behind it shimmered a glimmer of recognition, the faint spark of a soldier recognizing another who had also borne weight. The governor did not give speeches. He did not turn to the cameras. He simply extended his arm, offering not force but support. His hand rested lightly on William's elbow, steadying rather than restraining. Together they turned, facing the avenue where the flags had just passed. The crowd watched in silence, the moment stretched thin like glass about to break. The noise of dispersal ceased, replaced by a reverent hush that spread down the street like wind through grass. The spectacle of the parade had ended, but the meaning of it, its truest note, had only now begun to resonate. The air seemed to hold still, as if waiting for something larger to follow. Even the sergeant, once so eager to command, lowered his gaze, his authority drained of sharpness. Around them, heads bowed, children lifted their flags again without instruction, and the hush thickened until respect itself became a presence. The stand had been made. William Harker's eyes lifted, searching the governor's face as though testing whether this gesture was genuine or fleeting. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Instead, he allowed the weight of silence to bridge the gulf between them. The governor's hand, firm yet gentle on his elbow, did not press, did not command. It steadied. The two men, separated by a generation yet bound by the same oath, stood shoulder to shoulder in the middle of Main Street, as if the crowd around them no longer existed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, drawing their figures tall and solemn against the white stripes of the crosswalk. Behind them, the crowd seemed to instinctively fall quiet, like a congregation before a prayer. No applause yet, no outcry, only the collective hush of people watching something rare. The old man's salute had been stifled, but his dignity had not been erased. And now, beside him, another soldier lent weight to that silence. William's cane trembled faintly in his grasp, his hand slick with sweat, yet he did not falter. He held himself as straight as his body allowed, as though to prove that the years had not stolen everything. The governor mirrored him, shoulders squared, cap still against his chest, eyes steady on the fading banners of the parade. No one spoke between them, but there was understanding, wordless and profound, the kind only those who had borne the uniform could share. In the crowd, small shifts began. A woman near the front reached into her purse and drew out a folded tissue, not for herself, but to hand forward, offering it toward William, though it never reached his hand. A child, uncertain why the silence felt so heavy, lifted his little flag higher, waving not with excitement, but with reverence. A man who had scoffed earlier lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the ground, shame rising with each heartbeat. Even the sergeant, who only minutes before had barked orders with unflinching force, seemed altered. His shoulders slackened, the rigid set of his jaw softened, and his eyes shifted from the old man's face to the governor's. Something in that pairing, one frail and trembling, the other authoritative and steady, struck him with a weight he had not anticipated. His hands, once clenched on his belt, fell loosely at his sides. He said nothing, but his silence was no longer born of defiance. It was the silence of recognition. William finally exhaled, a long breath that seemed to release not just the air from his lungs but the tension of the moment. He tilted his head toward the governor, the smallest nod, gratitude compressed into a gesture so slight it could have been missed. The governor returned it, equally spare, equally potent. They did not need more. For the first time that day, the parade no longer belonged to the floats or the marching bands. It belonged to the two men standing in the avenue, unbroken by years, by jeers, or by command. It was no longer a spectacle to be watched. It was a moment to be witnessed. Then the governor leaned slightly toward William, voice low but steady, pitched so that those nearby could hear, though it was not meant for all. "Were you at Chosin?" The words carried the weight of memory, of scars that never healed. The question itself was enough to still the air again, because it was not one any civilian would think to ask. The governor's question lingered in the heavy summer air, like a bell tolling across distance. "Were you at Chosin?" The syllables struck not only William's ears, but his memory, summoning images buried so deeply they rarely surfaced. His eyes, dimmed by age yet sharpened now by recollection, turned toward the man beside him. For a heartbeat, the noise of the dispersing parade dulled, muffled as if snow had fallen across Main Street itself. William's lips trembled before words emerged, low and raw. "Winter of '50. The snow burned like fire." His voice cracked on the last word, not with weakness, but with truth so cold it still lived in him. His hand flexed on the cane as though the old wound ached again. In his mind, the white expanse returned. Mountains cloaked in frost, breath freezing before it left the lungs, brothers in arms staggering against the endless night. For a brief moment, he was not on Main Street but back in Korea, where the cold cut deeper than bullets. Governor Dwyer's jaw set. His eyes glistened with recognition, not pity. He nodded once, slow, as if to acknowledge not only the answer, but the man who had given it. Then, after a pause, long enough for the crowd to lean forward unconsciously, he replied, "Da Nang, 68. The rain never stopped." His voice had the same weight, the same fracture of memory carried across decades. Where William's snow had burned like fire, Dwyer's rain had drowned the jungle, thick and relentless, soaking men to the marrow. Different wars, different terrains, but the same endless endurance. The words carried beyond the two of them. Those closest in the crowd heard, and those farther back caught enough to understand. They exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to realization. It was no longer just an old man defying a police order. It was two soldiers, each carrying scars invisible to the eye, laying them quietly in the open for all to see. The truth landed like a stone in water, sending ripples outward through the gathered town. William did not speak again, but his silence was no longer empty. It was filled now with the echo of battles survived, of comrades lost, of landscapes that had branded themselves into his memory. The crowd, once restless and uncertain, felt the weight of those unspoken years pressing against their own hearts. Some lowered their eyes. Others swallowed hard, their throats tight with shame for the laughter, for the whispers, for the indifference that had filled the street earlier. Even the sergeant felt it. His hands, which had rested on his belt, shifted uneasily. He looked at the veteran anew, no longer as an obstruction, but as a man who had walked through storms he could barely imagine. The authority of his badge, his rules, his orders seemed paper-thin in comparison to the authority carried in William's few words. His mouth opened as if to say something, then closed again. Silence the only reply he could offer. The governor's hand remained lightly on William's elbow, a gesture that had shifted from support to solidarity. His eyes scanned the crowd, making certain they understood. Without raising his voice, without giving a speech, he had revealed the truth. Here stood men who had carried more than any regulation or barricade could measure. And the men who mocked him, the voices that whispered, the eyes that turned away, could no longer look at him without seeing it. The silence that had fallen was no longer the silence of confusion. It was reverence, uneasy at first, then spreading until it anchored the entire street. Governor Dwyer lifted his head, his voice steady but low, carrying with the gravity of command honed over decades. "Let it be known," he said, pausing so every syllable sank deep. "This man is William Harker, United States Army. He has stood for us longer than most of us have been alive. He will not be pushed aside again." His words were not shouted, but they carried farther than the loudest bark. The authority of his tone was not borrowed from office or badge. It was born of memory, scars, and the silence of men who never came home. A ripple moved through the crowd. People who had sat turned instinctively to their feet. Folding chairs creaked shut, as if compelled by something larger than politeness. Flags rose higher in children's hands, no longer waved in excitement, but held aloft with the slow, deliberate lift of respect. Mothers pressed palms to their hearts. Fathers straightened their posture. Even the teenagers who had snickered earlier stared at the ground, the weight of their laughter now heavy in their throats. The sergeant remained frozen for a moment, caught between the reflex of authority and the new current that had swept through the gathering. His badge gleamed under the sunlight, but its shine was nothing compared to the recognition that now surrounded William. The governor's eyes met his, holding him there. And then the words came, quiet but sharp. "Escort him? No. Walk with him." It was not an order barked in anger, but a correction, a recalibration of what duty truly meant. The sergeant swallowed, his throat moving as though the words he wanted to protest had been crushed under their own weight. He stepped forward, posture altered, not stiff with command but softened with humility. His hand gestured toward William's other side, not to seize but to steady, waiting for permission rather than forcing compliance. William glanced at him once, eyes lingering long enough to acknowledge the shift, then gave a small nod. That nod alone was acceptance enough. Together, the three men moved slowly back toward the reviewing stand, William in the middle, the governor on one side, the humbled officer on the other. Each step was deliberate, measured, cane tapping softly against the pavement like a metronome keeping time. The crowd parted before them in silence, and then, like a single breath released, applause began. It was not the frenzied clatter of a parade audience, but the slow, steady rhythm of hands striking in respect. A rolling sound that grew, not because of spectacle, but because recognition demanded it. Flags lifted higher along the avenue. The air swelled with a dignity that had been missing all morning, restored now by a man who had endured humiliation without surrendering grace. William walked with his head high, his cane steady, his lips pressed in quiet composure. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply endured the respect, as he had endured the shame, silently, with dignity intact. By the time they reached the stand, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a shove, a command, a public humiliation, had become a public recognition carved into the memory of everyone present. The parade itself had ended, but this was the moment they would remember. But the story did not end there. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, Main Street had quieted. The vendors had folded their carts, the music had faded into memory, and only the faint rustle of paper flags skittering along the pavement remained. Yet one bench near the flagpole was not empty. William Harker sat there. His cane leaned neatly against the armrest, his beret resting carefully on his knee. The lines in his face, deepened by the afternoon strain, had softened now into something calmer. His eyes, still sharp beneath the weight of years, watched the flag ripple above him in the evening breeze. Governor Samuel Dwyer sat beside him, the dark fabric of his suit jacket creased after a day of wear. Neither man spoke at first. They did not need to. The silence they shared was different from the silence of humiliation earlier. This silence was the kind carried between men who understood without words, who had stood where few could stand and endured what few could endure. It was a silence of brotherhood. The sergeant appeared once more, slower this time, no command in his gait. His hat was in his hands, not on his head, and the stiffness of authority had given way to something humbler. He stopped a pace away, his eyes lowered slightly. The governor turned, but said nothing. William lifted his chin, meeting the man's gaze. The sergeant inclined his head, a single nod offered not out of duty, but out of respect. William returned it, brief and unadorned. No words were needed. Respect, once withheld, had been restored. In the days that followed, word spread through the town about what had happened. Not from newspapers or official statements, but from those who had stood along Main Street, who had seen the old soldier pushed aside and then walked back into his rightful place. Conversations at diners and gas stations circled back to the same moment, the sight of William Harker standing firm and the governor stepping down from the stand to stand beside him. Stories grew, but none inflated. The truth itself was enough. The next year, when Memorial Day returned, a new ritual began. At the front of the parade route, near the reviewing stand, a wooden chair was placed beside the barricade. It was not marked by plaque or banner, not announced by speech or fanfare, but everyone knew what it meant. It was reserved for veterans who came to stand or sit near the colors as they passed. Children were told not to touch it, not to move it. They were told why it was there. For the ones who stood before us. When William returned that next year, cane in hand, he found the chair waiting. He touched its backrest with the same care he once gave to the stock of a rifle, then sat, his beret in his lap. No one told him to move. No one shoved or barked commands. Families greeted him quietly, some with nods, some with handshakes, all with the recognition owed but too often forgotten. The officer who had once forced him back now stood nearby, his posture altered, his watchful eyes protective rather than impatient. The parade passed as always, bands, floats, flags. But the true spectacle was no longer the noise or the color. It was the presence of the chair, the old man seated proudly in it, and the memory etched into the town by what had happened the year before. Respect had been reclaimed, not by decree or law, but by the endurance of one man and the recognition of another who chose to stand with him. And as the evening sun lowered once again over Main Street, William lifted his hand in salute, slow and trembling but unbroken, a gesture that no one would ever again dare to deny. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this brought back a memory you carry with you. And the best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.